I remember being young and innocent when the Elder Scrolls Skyrim came out, and thinking to myself, how ambitious is this series going to get in like 10 years? When we get, for instance, the Elder Scrolls 8 or 9, how incredible are they going to be? What upgrades will we get? These vast worlds, everything seemed possible back then. And yet at the current pace of game development, I'm going to be like 75 years old by the time we get to an Elder Scrolls 9 or whatever. That is the pace of game development. That's what we're told anyway. It seems to be an undisputed fact that we can't argue with, that games in the modern day in 2024, they take a long time. It takes years and years, maybe even a decade, to make a video game at this point. Now, I've been scratching my head at that idea for quite some time, because if we go back to the late 90s, the early 2000s, we often got incredible games in series annually, almost every year, and not in a Call of Duty way where it felt like a total cash grab. You think of like Baldur's Gate, the original, and then you get to Baldur's Gate 2. The second game in that series, it was a huge upgrade. It only came a couple of years maybe later, and it was so vast. The fact that they were able to create that in a short time, that's impossible now, seemingly. It just does not happen. These games take so long. I was willing to accept it, like when we got into the Xbox One, PS4 kind of era where, yeah, games maybe took a year or two longer than they used to. I can live with that. I understand maybe the graphics, the art, it gets expensive. But now it has gotten ridiculous, where you get these games that take maybe 9 or 10 years, and then you play them and you think, this is not better than whatever games I was playing when I was 13 years old. And I'll give you a clear example. The recent Xbox showcase, they showed off all of these games, Fable, Perfect Dark, a bunch of others. Many of these have been in development for 5+ years now, and there's very little to show for it. And Perfect Dark, the original, how long did that take? It was the sequel essentially to GoldenEye 64, the spiritual successor. It took something like 2 years, and now the current Perfect Dark that they're making, it's been in development forever. And I guarantee when it comes out, it's probably not going to be as good and as memorable as the original. And yet it takes this long. Now, the answer the industry gives us is, oh, development's so expensive now, you need so many people, it's so hard, these poor devs, they work to death, it's just almost impossible, and yet they get this game to you. That's the narrative. I don't really believe it anymore. What it feels like to me, because I see this in other industries as well, is developers pretty much covering for themselves, where if you work in that space, you don't want to be the one who comes out and goes, you know what? A lot of devs, they muck around, they don't really do their job properly, they're on Twitter half the day, you've got people changing their pronouns in their email signature every 7 hours. Not a lot of work is seemingly getting done. And it honestly feels somewhat like a culture thing. Like it's mainly the Western studios that are having this problem. Development hell with every second game, a million excuses for why a game takes forever. Because you look across the sea and you look at, say, a lot of Japanese studios, Japanese gaming companies, where you've got Nintendo. The Nintendo Switch has been out for like 7+ years now, and they had a goal of releasing an exclusive game every single month. They haven't quite hit that, that's pretty ambitious, but they've been pretty damn close. That console has a lot of games. And sure, a lot of them are cash grab remasters, Wii U ports and so on, but there's been a fair bit of original content. They get games out in a reasonable time frame, that sort of 3-4 year mark, which makes sense. It seems like they're passionate, they work hard on those games. You look at Capcom with the Resident Evil series, we've got a lot of them over the last few years. It's kept that series relevant, there's always interest. And you go back to Microsoft again, I'm just thinking of them because of that recent presentation. I mean, they're crappy managers, obviously, but they're a huge publisher now and a good example of the Western studio problem where Halo, like the time between Halo 5 and Infinite, like 10 years, you play Infinite, and what is it? It's like a Ubisoft-y Halo campaign. That did not need to take 10 years, and the multiplayer was bare bones as well. I don't believe that that was the result of, oh, games are too hard to make. It is incompetence. at these studios. And I bring this up because Dragon Age developer Mark Darrah has made a 25-minute video explaining why AAA games take so long. And I want to go over some of the main points, but the nagging feeling I had when I watched it was just that idea of developers covering for each other. I mean, Mark brings up some points that are probably true, but I think it kind of glances over the bigger issue, which for me is just a lot of these Western studios, they are just managed poorly. And it's not excusing the individual devs, because I see this a lot as well, where you've got a studio of 100 employees, 95 of them are just incredible, talented developers who will do fantastic work, but it's all ruined because of 5 evil managers at the top taking all the money. That is a narrative that gets pushed often by like Jason Schreier and a lot of people who seem to be pushing political messages. It's all about anti-capitalism messages, not really about what's actually going on. That doesn't seem to be their main focus. But what I will say is this, I mean, management is ultimately responsible. So for instance, if you as a management team, you hire 90 morons and they're all doing a bad job, well, you can't just blame that on those employees. You hired them. The buck ultimately stops with you. So the managers are the ones ultimately responsible. But I just want to dismiss the idea that everyone working on a video game is fantastic, talented, and it's the managers ruining it. I don't believe that. It is a little mixture of both, and ultimately it does feel like a bit of a culture problem overall. And when I speak about sort of covering for the industry, even just looking at this thumbnail, I just see things that don't seem quite right. I know it's probably not made to be super serious, but I still thought about it because it's the first thing I saw. And for instance, he's put here in the top left, Grand Theft Auto 5 came out in 2013, and then it took 12 years for us to get Grand Theft Auto 6. Well, it's not as if Rockstar have just been spending 12 years working hard on the sequel and it's just really, really difficult. That's not what happened. Grand Theft Auto 5 came out, huge success. They were planning to make single-player DLC, but then because the multiplayer component was so lucrative, all these morons or kids stealing daddy's credit card were spending so much money on microtransactions, they didn't want to make a sequel. They were making so much coin from number 5, why make a sequel? So they've delayed that for as long as possible. They've gone a whole console generation without releasing an original GTA, and that was about money. It wasn't about games being so hard to make. He puts his own game, or at least a Bioware game, where he works in here as well, kind of explaining Dragon Age Inquisition came out in 2014, and now we're getting the sequel, The Veilguard, 10 years later in 2024. Well, again, the reason this took so long is because BioWare is full of idiots and they devoted all their time to Anthem. They weren't really working on it, even though it had a 6 or 7 year dev time. Only like 18 months was actually working on the game because they were twiddling their thumbs, not doing anything noteworthy for years and years of that. I think it was actually an executive who sort of saved them from total embarrassment by telling them, hey, the flying you put in the game that was kind of like Iron Man or something is actually decent. Keep that in the game. Do it. Don't scrap it. They were even going to get rid of the only seemingly good part. So an executive helped them there, even though a lot of these people will claim all the executives ruin absolutely everything. But the overall point is, the reason that Dragon Age has had a 10-year delay between releases is because of incompetence in the studio, bad people working on these games, making poor decisions. Many of them probably should have been moved on. It's not because games are so hard to make and they just need to take this long. That isn't true. Now, rather than watching this whole video here, we'll go through some of the key points that are in this article. So to begin with, Darrah counters the question of why AAA game development takes so long by simply saying that it doesn't. Or at least, it doesn't take as long as you might initially believe. Thank you, Mark, I believe this, and I feel like this is kind of exposing the industry by saying it. I don't think that was his point, but this is something I can get on board with. Games don't take this long. It's all the extra fucking around that seems to happen that leads to games just having these bloated dev times for no reason, and something has to be done. It's not sustainable. The industry as a whole knows that. You can't be spending all that money on wages and rent and everything for 7+ years to make a game. It doesn't economically work, and that's when you have to start forcing in microtransactions. You've got to make it a live service, all of these schemes, because the game's budget ended up being so much larger than it needed to be. In practice, various games get announced well in advance of full development taking place, with only small teams working on pre-production or ideation for several years. There might be a small nascent seed of a team, but really there isn't any work being done for quite a long time. Again, I can believe that. You get people working on a game, they're meant to be developing it, and they just sit around basically exchanging sob stories about how someone misgendered them at lunchtime. That sort of stuff. Now, obviously I'm exaggerating a little bit, maybe not completely, but I see this genuinely happen. I may not work in games, Mark knows much more than me about them, but I've worked at a number of companies, and the whole victim culture is a thing everywhere. It's not just on the internet, maybe it used to be, but now it definitely has filtered through to just about every workplace I've been in. And what I see a lot of is a ton of coddling, where a lot of managers, for instance, they don't want to just tell someone to pull their finger out and get on with it. They're sort of worried about their own position. So there's so much covering for each other, coddling. If someone says, oh, I can't work, it's all too hard, you need to change everything to suit me, which is totally inefficient, you'd be better off just getting rid of that person. That often doesn't happen. Instead, people bend over backwards to accommodate them. Then they sort of learn, hey, if I complain and whinge all the time, I end up getting what I want. And then this happens on a grand scale. If you've got heaps of people like that, how is any work actually going to be done? I see this all the time. There's a lack of efficiency. Work isn't getting done. And this is definitely happening with video games for sure, because anything I've experienced at general offices and corporate environments, I bet you it's 10 times worse in video games, where every employee just about is one of those whingers. Studios can kind of be misleading on this front, because they'll say things like, we've started work on Elder Scrolls 6, there might even be a trailer for the game, even though the current team size is under 10 people. Now, he might just be giving random examples, but I don't think this is a good one, because the reason that Bethesda announced Elder Scrolls 6 and showed that trailer, which goes against the policy that Todd has talked about, where they want to show games very close to release all the gameplay, all that stuff, and then maybe it comes out 6 months later. It was very odd with the Elder Scrolls 6, until you think about the motivations. At that presentation, I think it was E3, Fallout 76 was the main game that they wanted to show off and that they wanted to promote. But it was a live service that was different than their single-player titles before. Todd knew this, and he knew if they went all in on Fallout 76 at that presentation with nothing else, they would have got backlash. It was around that time of Diablo Immortal, where Blizzard got absolutely skewered. Everyone was laughing at them. They were an embarrassment when they went out at BlizzCon to show off Diablo Immortal. Don't you guys have phones? That absolute clown show. Todd learned from this, and he thought, all right, we'll announce Fallout 76, a very different game. Essentially, at that time, at least, it felt like a bit of a cash grab compared to what they'd done previously. But then they threw out their Elder Scrolls 6 and Starfield to say, don't worry, we've got you. The single-player games are coming. That was the reason that those were announced. Bethesda might deny that, but I know deep down that was the reason. There might be reasons why it's important for the studios or the publisher to have that game in the public consciousness, Darrah continues. It might be because the publisher's slate is a little weak, and they want the public to remember it still has important games in its back pocket. It might be because the studio wants the game announced because they're worried the publisher might kill it otherwise. Now, I find this kind of funny, because again, this is Mark Darrah at Bioware. And I think he's really just talking about Bioware. Not a lot of this seems to apply to other studios. He's basically saying that if you've released a game, you need to announce the next one ASAP, or the publisher might just kill you. I don't think that applies to like a genuine successful studio. Like, From Software is not completely independent. They have an owner. If they don't announce Elden Ring 2 tomorrow, I don't think they're in danger of getting killed. This just sounds like a Bioware problem, because you released Anthem, which was such an embarrassment. No one was interested in you anymore. No one would have really cared if you were shut down. And then you were in panic mode, so you had to race back to Dragon Age, announce it well ahead of time. So EA didn't shut you down. And EA are known for closing heaps of studios, even semi-successful ones. I've talked about Westwood Studios before. Great developer, great strategy games, even point-and-click adventures, RPGs as well, many underrated ones. They were shut down. They were doing good work. When have you done any good work, Bioware, in the last, 2 decades? You haven't done much. So if you were shut down, you only had yourselves to blame. This just feels like projection to me, a Bioware problem. The reason that games are taking so long, it's not because you're announcing them with a cinematic trailer 5 years before release, because games used to not take that long. They often took 2 or 3 years. This has nothing to do with it. I just feel like Mark, this Bioware employee, he wants to sort of tiptoe around the real issues, because those real issues, those hard-hitting issues, are ones that'll piss off his co-workers. The main reasons that games take so long are things like the cultural problems, because you're not hiring people based on merit. You're bringing people in because they share the same politics, they tick the right box, and then a lot of them, they dick around, they can't do the job properly, they produce a product that's mediocre, and it took years to release, because trying to manage a bunch of idiots all at once, not easy. That is something I can sympathize with management about, trying to get those people together to make a game. That's going to be very difficult. And even just stepping away from that, the focus on graphics and visuals, it feels like a lot of that is for the developers themselves. Things like flying to another country because they want to take pictures of rocks and the beach to make sure how they look visually in the game lines up 100% to be realistic. Gamers don't need that. We don't need everything to be about visuals. Make it about the gameplay. Make it about the systems we interact with. Those are what are actually immersive, not purely graphics, textures, and all of that. It's nice for a game to look beautiful, but not when it takes 8 years. If that's part of the reason, you need to pull back. If the budgets are getting inflated because of graphics and visuals, it's not going to work anymore. It's not going to be sustainable. I'm not going to accept games being ruined in terms of monetization, battle passes, all of that nonsense, because you wanted a single blade of grass to move in the wind exactly as it would in real life. That's not what gaming is about. And then you've got the bloat as well. Every game needing to be 100+ hours. I mean, with Ubisoft, it seems like they do that now to try and make their microtransaction stores more relevant, because if the game is 20 hours, you'd be less likely to buy an XP boost. All of that sort of crap. But I think a lot of people are seeing through the bloat now. If a game is really long and it feels unnecessary, it's not like an epic RPG with heaps of handcrafted quests. It's just a bunch of copy and pasted crap around the map. People have had enough of it. So the bloat isn't necessarily either. Split that out into different games. Wouldn't you make more money if you release one this year, you release another one next year, and both of them are 20 hours? I'm alright with that, because you should be focusing on quality over quantity. So this developer, this Dragon Age Bioware developer telling us why AAA games take so long, it just sounds like an excuse almost from Bioware, the company who produced rubbish for the longest time. Dragon Age the Veilguard looks like more of the same in the vein of Andromeda, Anthem, in terms of its quality, and I think gamers are right to speak out about these ridiculous development cycles. Point two, say Japanese studios abroad, who seem to make games a bit quicker, often better as well. Often they end up being much better, even though they were made in a much shorter space of time. So it's something for Western studios to think about. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you on the next one. Cheers. Bye.